Military production during World War II includes the arms, ammunitions, natural resources, personnel and financing which were mobilized for the war. Military production, in this article, means everything produced by the belligerents from the occupation of Austria in early 1938 to the surrender and occupation of Japan in late 1945. The mobilization of funds, people, natural resources and material for the production and supply of military equipment and military forces during World War II was a critical component of the war effort. During the conflict, the Allies outpaced the Axis powers in most production categories. Access to the funding and industrial resources necessary to sustain the war effort was linked to their respective economic and political alliances. As formerly neutral powers joined the escalating conflict, territory changed hands, combatants were defeated. The balance of power shifted in favor of the Allies. Historical context. During the 1930s, political forces in Germany increased their financial investment in the military to develop the armed forces required to support near and long-term political and territorial goals. Germany's economic, scientific, research and industrial capabilities were one of the most technically advanced in the world at the time and supported a rapidly growing, innovative military. However, access to resources and production capacity required to entertain long-term goals were limited. Political demands necessitated the expansion of Germany's control of natural and human resources, industrial capacity and farmland beyond its borders. Germany's military production was tied to resources outside its area of control, a dynamic not found amongst the Allies. In 1938, the British Commonwealth was a global superpower, with political and economic control of a quarter of the world's population, industry and resources. From 1938 to mid-1942, the British coordinated the Allied effort in all global theaters. They fought the German, Italian, Japanese and Vichy armies, air forces and navies across Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, India, the Mediterranean and in the Atlantic, Indian, Pacific and Arctic Oceans. British forces destroyed Italian armies in North and East Africa and occupied overseas colonies of occupied European nations. Following engagements with Axis forces, British Empire troops occupied Libya, Italian Somaliland, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Iran and Iraq. The Empire funded and delivered needed supplies by Arctic convoys to the USSR, and supported Free French forces to recapture French Equatorial Africa. Britain also established governments in exile in London to rally support in occupied Europe for the Allied effort. The British defeated, held back or slowed the Axis powers for 3 years while mobilizing their globally integrated economy and industrial infrastructure to build what became, by 1942, the most extensive military apparatus of the war. This allowed their later allies to mobilize their economies and develop the military forces required to play a role in the war effort, and for the British to go on the offensive in its theaters of operation. The entry of the United States into the war in late 1941 injected financial, human and industrial resources into Allied operations. Like the Commonwealth countries, the U.S. produced more than its own military forces required and armed itself and its allies for the most industrialized war in history. At the beginning of the war, the British and French placed large orders for aircraft with American manufacturers and the U.S. Congress approved plans to increase its air forces by 3,000 planes. In May 1940, Franklin D. Roosevelt called for the production of 185,000 aeroplanes, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns and 18 million tons of merchant shipping in 2 years. Adolf Hitler was told by his advisors that this was American propaganda. In 1939, annual aircraft production for the U.S. military was less than 3,000 planes. By the end of the war, U.S. factories had produced 300,000 planes. and by 1944 had produced two-thirds of the Allied military equipment used in the war, bringing military forces into play in North and South America, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, Western Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. produced large quantities of military equipment into late 1945, including nuclear weapons, and became one of the strongest, most technically advanced military forces in the world. In addition to outproducing the Axis, the Allies produced technological innovations through the TIS mission. British contributions included radar, sonar, and the proximity fuse. The Americans led the Manhattan Project. The proximity fuse, for example, was 5 times as effective as contact or timed fuses and was devastating in naval use against Japanese aircraft and so effective against German ground troops that General George S. Patton said it won the Battle of the Bulge for us. The human and social costs of the war on the population of the USSR were immense, with combat deaths alone in the millions. Recognizing the importance of their population and industrial production to the war effort, the USSR evacuated the majority of its European territory, moving 2,500 factories, 17 million people and great quantities of resources to the east, out of German reach. The USSR produced equipment and forces critical to the Axis defeat in Europe. Over 1 million women served in the Soviet armed forces. The statistics below illustrate the extent to which the Allies outproduced the Axis. Production of machine tools tripled, and thousands of ships were built in shipyards which did not exist before the war. According to William S. Knudsen, we won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen, nor dreamed possible. Access to resources and large, controlled international labor pools and the ability to build arms in relative peace were critical to the eventual victory of the Allies. According to Donald Douglas, here's proof that free men can outproduce slaves. Production Summaries 1939 to 1945. Personnel Major Weapons Groups Economy in billions of international dollars, at 2014 prices. Vital commerce and raw materials cargo and resources in metric tons. Production overview. Service, power and type. Air forces, land forces, naval forces, commercial forces, resources, all figures in millions of tons. Reference data for summary tables. GDP provides insight into the relative strength of the belligerents in the run-up to, and during the conflict. Billions of international dollars, at 1990 prices, adjusted annually for changing compositions within each alliance. In 1939, the USSR invaded and took over eastern Poland. The USSR occupied the Baltic states in mid-1940. Alaska and Hawaii did not become states of the U.S. until post-war. GDP ratio. A 2.06 ratio means combined Allied GDP was 2.06 times higher than Axis GDP. Table notes. France to Axis. 1940 to 50%, 1941 minus 44 to 100%. USSR to Allies. 1941 to 44%, 1942 minus 1945 to 100%. U.S. direct support to the Allies begins with Lend-Lease in March 1941. Though the U.S. made it possible for the Allies to purchase U.S.-produced materiel from 1939. Italy to Allies and Axis. 1938 to 0%, 1939 minus 1943 to 100% Axis, 1944 minus 1945 to 100% Allies. Japanese to Axis begins with Tripartite Pact in 1940. The Allied and Axis totals are not the immediate sum of the table values. See the distribution rules used above. Personnel. Allied, British Empire including all non-British subjects in British services. Note: auxiliary units include Home Guard, reserves, police regiments, etc. Personnel. Axis. German Reich, including all non-German subjects in German services. Note: auxiliary units include Home Guard, Wehrmacht, Stuffolger, reserves, police regiments, etc. USSR includes Armenia 4 KSS, 14 KWER, 7 KO, Azerbaijan 55 KSS, 70 KWER, Belarus 12 KWER, 20 KO, Cossack 200 KWER, Estonia 20 KSS, 50 KWER, 7 KO, Georgia 10 KSS, 30 KWER, Karmik 5 KWER, Latvia 55 KSS, 87 KWER, 300 Air, 23 KO, Lithuania 50 KWER, 10-0, North Caucasus 4 KSS, Russia 60 KSS, 26 KWER, Turkestan 16 KWER, Ukrainian 300 KWER, 2 KO, Tatar, Urals 12 KWER. Aircraft. Allied, British Empire within the UK. Initially aircraft production was very vulnerable to enemy bombing. To expand and diversify the production base, the British set up shadow factories. These brought other manufacturing companies, such as vehicle manufacturers, into aircraft production, or aircraft parts production. These inexperienced companies were set up in groups under the guidance or control of the aircraft manufacturers. New factory buildings were provided with government money. Aircraft. Allies, France, Poland and minor powers production numbers until the time of the German occupation of the respective country. Some types listed were in production before the war. Those listed were still in production at the time of or after the Munich crisis. Aircraft. Axis. All occupied countries produced weapons for the Axis powers. Figures are for the period of occupation only. Propaganda posters.